The European decision at the center of this analysis did not arrive as a dramatic rupture or a public declaration. It emerged through a series of procedural choices, legal constraints, and political accommodations that, taken individually, appeared modest. Yet from a realist perspective, its significance lies precisely in this quietness. Deterrence depends not only on material capabilities, but on the credibility of commitments and the clarity of signals sent to potential challengers. When major actors adjust policies in ways that blur those signals, the consequences may accumulate gradually rather than explosively. This case suggests how institutionalized restraint, while often defensible on domestic or normative grounds, can interact with power politics in destabilizing ways. At its core, deterrence is a relational concept. It rests on an adversary's belief that the costs of a particular action will outweigh the benefits. For that belief to hold, two conditions must generally be satisfied. The deterring actor must possess the relevant capabilities, and it must be perceived as willing to use them under specified circumstances. The European decision in question did not directly eliminate capabilities. Instead, it altered expectations about future behavior by narrowing the scope of automatic responses, introducing additional veto points, or redefining thresholds for action. Such adjustments often reflect legitimate concerns about escalation control, alliance cohesion, or domestic legitimacy. However, they also raise the possibility that deterrent threats become less legible to outside observers. From a structural realist standpoint, the issue matters because Europe occupies a pivotal position in the contemporary balance of power. While no single European state rivals the largest global powers, Europe collectively represents a substantial share of global economic output, technological capacity, and latent military potential. The credibility of European deterrence, whether exercised independently or through alliances, therefore shapes the strategic calculations of other major actors. Decisions that condition or delay collective responses may indicate prudence, but they also signal that internal constraints could impede rapid action in a crisis. The incentives driving this decision were not irrational. European governments operate within dense institutional frameworks designed to prevent unilateralism and reduce the risks of entrapment. These institutions reward consensus building, legal precision, and proportionality. They also reflect historical experiences in which unchecked executive authority produced catastrophic outcomes. In that sense, restraint is not an accidental feature of European strategy, but a deliberate one. Yet structural realism suggests that adversaries evaluate outcomes rather than intentions. What matters is not why a policy exists, but how it affects expected responses to provocation. The underlying power dynamics further complicate the picture. Europe remains strategically dependent to varying degrees on external security guarantees, particularly in high-intensity conflict scenarios. This dependence creates incentives to hedge, to avoid actions that might force allies into unwanted commitments, and to preserve diplomatic flexibility. At the same time, it reduces the costs of ambiguity. If ultimate deterrence is believed to rest elsewhere, European actors may tolerate incremental erosion of their own credibility without immediately perceiving severe risks. This dynamic indicates how alliance structures can both bolster and undermine deterrence simultaneously. Importantly, the decision did not occur in a vacuum. It followed a period of sustained pressure on European institutions to clarify red lines, codify response mechanisms, and ensure democratic oversight of security policy. Each of these goals is defensible in isolation, yet when combined, they can produce a strategic posture that emphasizes process over signaling. Potential challengers observing this emphasis may infer that responses will be slow, contested, or reversible. Even if such inferences are inaccurate, the mere possibility can affect behavior at the margins. The realist concern, therefore, is not that Europe chose caution over confrontation, but that the cumulative effect of proceduralized restraint may weaken deterrence without offering compensating stabilizers. Deterrence does not require recklessness, but it does require a degree of predictability. When predictability is replaced by conditionality and layered approval mechanisms, the deterrent message becomes harder to interpret. This suggests why seemingly technical decisions can carry strategic weight, even when they attract little public attention. The institutional context in which this European decision unfolded is central to understanding its broader effects. European security policy is mediated through overlapping national, supranational, and alliance-based institutions, each with distinct rules and constituencies. This complexity is often praised for reducing the likelihood of impulsive action. However, it also creates strategic externalities that are not always fully anticipated by policymakers focused on internal coherence. The decision under review illustrates how institutional behavior can generate second-order effects that extend beyond the immediate policy domain. One such effect concerns alliance signaling. Alliances function not only as mechanisms for pooling capabilities, but as communication devices. They convey shared expectations about threat perception and response. When a key set of allies introduces new conditions or limitations on collective action, it alters the alliance's signaling environment. Even if the formal commitments remain unchanged, the perceived reliability of those commitments may shift. This does not necessarily imply alliance decay, but it does suggest a recalibration of expectations by both allies and adversaries. The trade-offs involved were real. European institutions faced persistent concerns about escalation dynamics, particularly in scenarios involving nuclear-armed adversaries. There is a rational fear that rigid deterrent postures can lock actors into self-reinforcing cycles of threat and counter-threat. By embedding flexibility and legal review into decision-making, European actors aim to preserve room for de-escalation. Yet flexibility for one side often appears as uncertainty to another. Structural realism indicates that uncertainty, when asymmetric, can incentivize probing behavior rather than restraint. Historical precedents offer limited but suggestive parallels. In the interwar period, collective security arrangements emphasize consultation and unanimity, partly to ensure legitimacy. These arrangements struggled when confronted with actors willing to exploit procedural delays. The analogy should not be overstretched, as contemporary Europe operates in a vastly different strategic and normative environment. Still, the comparison highlights a recurring tension between institutional legitimacy and strategic effectiveness. Institutions designed to prevent misuse of power can inadvertently constrain timely responses to external challenges. Another unintended consequence relates to burden distribution within alliances. When some members adopt more restrictive rules for engagement, others may feel pressure to compensate. This can lead to informal differentiation, where a subset of actors assumes disproportionate responsibility for deterrence tasks. While such differentiation may enhance short-term effectiveness, it risks long-term friction. Allies asked to bear greater risks may question the reciprocity of commitments, particularly if constraints are seen as politically motivated rather than structurally unavoidable. The decision also interacts with domestic political incentives. By emphasizing procedural safeguards, governments can reassure skeptical publics that security policy remains under civilian control. However, this reassurance may come at the cost of strategic clarity. Adversaries do not observe domestic debates directly. They infer intentions from observable outcomes. If those outcomes suggest hesitation or fragmentation, deterrence may weaken regardless of domestic approval. Crucially, none of these effects imply deliberate miscalculation. The institutional logic was internally consistent, and the immediate benefits were tangible. What structural realism highlights is the gap between internal rationality and external perception. Decisions optimized for domestic legitimacy and alliance harmony can still generate adverse strategic signals. These signals may not provoke immediate crises, but they can shape the environment in which future crises unfold. In this sense, the decision reflects a broader pattern in contemporary international politics, the growing influence of institutional process on strategic outcomes. As security governance becomes more legalized and multi-layered, the relationship between intention and effect becomes more indirect. This raises the possibility that deterrence erodes not through dramatic policy reversals, but through gradual accumulation of constraints that collectively reduce perceived resolve. The long-term implications of this European decision are likely to unfold incrementally rather than through abrupt shifts in the international order. Deterrence failures, when they occur, are rarely traceable to a single moment. They emerge from patterns of interaction in which expectations adjust over time. From a realist perspective, the key question is how other actors incorporate this decision into their broader assessments of European and allied behavior. One plausible outcome is strategic adaptation by potential challengers. Rather than overtly testing red lines, they may engage in calibrated actions designed to remain below perceived thresholds. Such behavior suggests an expectation that responses will be contested internally or delayed procedurally. This does not imply that Europe would be unable to respond, but that the costs of initial probes are assessed as manageable. Over time, this pattern can normalize incremental challenges, shifting the baseline of acceptable behavior. Another implication concerns alliance dynamics. Allies may quietly adjust their own planning assumptions, placing greater emphasis on unilateral or minilateral arrangements. This does not necessarily weaken formal institutions, but it can hollow them out functionally. If key actors come to view institutional mechanisms as too constrained for certain contingencies, they may seek parallel channels that offer greater flexibility. The resulting fragmentation could complicate coordination in high-stakes scenarios. Institutional credibility is also at stake. Credibility does not require rigidity, but it does require consistency between declared commitments and observable practices. When procedures appear to override commitments in ambiguous situations, external observers may downgrade the reliability of future assurances. This process is subtle and often reversible, but it operates continuously. Restoring credibility typically requires sustained patterns of behavior rather than declarative statements. Looking ahead, European actors are likely to continue balancing deterrence with restraint. Structural constraints, including economic interdependence and domestic political diversity, limit the range of feasible options. It is therefore unlikely that the decision will be formally reversed. Instead, adjustments may occur at the margins through reinterpretation of rules or selective exemptions. Such adaptations indicate an awareness of the trade-offs involved, even if they do not resolve them fully. The broader international order is shaped by these micro-level decisions. As great power competition intensifies, the signaling environment becomes more sensitive to ambiguity. Europe's challenge is not unique. Many actors face similar tensions between institutionalized restraint and strategic clarity. What distinguishes this case is Europe's central role in existing alliance structures and its capacity to influence norms of response. In realist terms, the decision underscores a familiar observation. Institutions both reflect and shape power relations. They are not neutral arbiters of security outcomes. When institutional design prioritizes certain values, it inevitably de-emphasizes others. The long-term effect on deterrence depends on how these priorities interact with shifting power distributions. The most sober conclusion is that the decision neither guarantees instability nor preserves stability by default. It introduces variables that other actors will interpret and test in probabilistic ways. Deterrence, under these conditions, becomes less a fixed property and more an evolving relationship. Understanding that evolution requires attention to structure, incentives, and perception rather than to isolated policy choices.